My name is Claire Whitfield, and on the day my parents handed me the keys to a house that was falling apart at the seams, a house with a caved-in roof, black mold crawling up the walls, and a smell like wet rot that clung to my clothes for days. They handed my younger sister the keys to a brand-new 3-bedroom apartment in the most expensive part of town, fully furnished, fully paid for, with a bow on the door like she'd won a game show. My mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "You've always been the strong one, Claire. You'll figure it out." I didn't cry. Not that day. I smiled, took the keys, and drove to that dying house alone, in the dark, in the rain, and sat in my car outside it for 45 minutes because I was too afraid to go inside. I had no idea that 3 weeks later, a stranger would knock on that rotting front door, a man I had never met, holding a folder of documents that would tear my entire family's history apart, expose 30 years of lies, and turn the house everyone pitted me for into the very thing that would bring my parents to their knees, begging me for forgiveness I was no longer sure I wanted to give. This is the story of how the house they used to punish me became the reason they lost everything else. I need to take you back further than that night in the rain, because you won't understand how much that moment cost me unless you understand the 31 years that led up to it. I am the older daughter. My sister, Renee, is 3 years younger, and from the moment she was born, our house rearranged itself around her like furniture around a fireplace. Everything else existed to make room for the warmth she gave off. And I was the drafty corner nobody bothered to fix. I don't say that with self-pity. I say it because it's true, and because for most of my life, I trained myself not to notice it. When Renee was 6 and I was 9, she broke my mother's favorite vase reaching for a cookie jar she wasn't supposed to touch. I got blamed because I was the oldest and should have been watching her. When I was 12, I won a regional spelling competition and came home holding a trophy nearly as tall as my torso. My father glanced at it, said, "That's nice," and went back to helping Renee with a finger painting project for kindergarten. I remember standing in the doorway of the kitchen holding that trophy like it was suddenly the heaviest object I had ever carried, waiting for someone to ask me a single question about it. Nobody did. By the time I was 16, I understood the family currency, and I understood that I would never be rich in it. Renee got new clothes for every school year. I got Renee's old clothes, taken in at the waist by my grandmother, because my mother said sewing wasn't her strong suit and neither, apparently, was buying me anything of my own. Renee got a car for her 17th birthday, a little red hatchback with a bow around it, the same theatrical bow my mother would put on that apartment 15 years later. Like she had one single gesture of love and reused it for the daughter she'd decided was worth the performance. I took the bus to my part-time job at a pharmacy until I saved enough for a used sedan with a cracked windshield and a check engine light that never turned off. I want to be clear about something, because this isn't a story about a villain sister. Renee didn't ask for any of this. She was a child soaking up whatever was poured onto her, the same as I was a child starving in the same room. If anything, we might have been close, might have understood each other if our parents hadn't spent 2 decades training us both, her to expect adoration, and me to expect nothing, as if we were opposite ends of the same broken experiment. The pattern didn't stop when we became adults. If anything, it calcified. When Renee graduated college, a private university our parents paid for in full, they threw her a party with a live band. When I graduated from state school 2 years earlier, having worked nights to pay my own tuition because we already spent so much getting your sister into the right kindergarten programs when she was small, Claire, surely you understand budgets are tight. My mother sent a card. Not even in person. A card, mailed to my dorm, with $40 folded inside and a handwritten note that said, "So proud of you, sweetheart. Love, Mom." I kept that card in a drawer for years. I don't know why. Maybe some small, stubborn part of me thought if I held on to the evidence long enough, it would eventually add up to something that felt like love. When Renee got engaged at 26, my parents paid for the entire wedding, over $60,000, I found out later, for a venue with a chandelier imported from Italy and a photographer who normally shot celebrity weddings. When I got engaged at 28 to a kind, quiet man named Daniel who worked in logistics and made me laugh until my stomach hurt. My mother's first question was, "Are you sure you're not settling? You could still do better, Claire." Renee's marriage ended in a divorce 18 months later, after her husband was caught having an affair with a mutual friend. My parents rallied around her instantly, called her so brave, helped her move back into a condo they quietly financed, and spoke about the divorce for years afterward as though Renee had survived a natural disaster rather than made choices in a marriage like every other adult on earth. My marriage to Daniel, by contrast, was treated as an inconvenient footnote in the family story. Nobody asked how we were doing. Nobody remembered our anniversary. When Daniel lost his job during a company restructuring 3 years into our marriage, and I picked up extra shifts and we ate rice and beans for 4 months to stay afloat, my parents never once offered so much as a phone call to check in, though they knew. My mother mentioned it once, in passing, at a holiday dinner. "I heard things have been tight for you too." "That's a shame." Then she turned and asked Renee about her upcoming vacation to Cabo. I tell you all of this not because I want your sympathy, though if you've lived any version of this story yourself, in any family, I suspect you already have it, and I'm grateful for it. But because you need to understand that by the time my parents made the decision about the houses, none of it was a surprise to me. It was simply the loudest, most expensive, most undeniable version of a message they had been sending me my entire life. I was 31 years old. My grandmother, my father's mother, a sharp, private woman named Eleanor Whitfield who had lived alone in the same house for nearly 50 years, had passed away 6 months earlier, quietly, in her sleep, the way she'd always said she hoped to go. She left behind that house, a 2-story colonial on Maple Hollow Road that had once been beautiful, with wraparound porches and stained glass transoms above the doors. But that had slid into disrepair over the last decade of her life as her health declined, and she stopped being able to keep up with it. She also left behind, or so everyone assumed at the time, very little else. My grandmother had lived modestly. She clipped coupons well into her 80s. She wore the same 3 cardigans on rotation for as long as I could remember. Nobody in my family thought there was anything valuable left of Eleanor Whitfield's estate except that crumbling house and whatever furniture was still inside it. My parents inherited the house, since my father was her only child. And 6 months after the funeral, at a family dinner that I now understand had been engineered from the start, they announced what they intended to do with it, and with Renee's newly ended lease on her apartment. I still remember the exact words. I will remember them for the rest of my life. It was a Sunday in early spring. My mother had made a roast, which should have been my first warning, because my mother only cooked elaborate meals when she wanted an audience for something. Daniel and I arrived at 6. Renee was already there, curled into the corner of the couch with a glass of wine, looking, as always, effortlessly at ease in a house that had never once made me feel that way. We ate. We made small talk about Renee's job at a marketing firm, about Daniel's new position. He'd finally landed something after the layoff, a modest but steady role at a shipping logistics company, about the weather, about nothing. And then, over dessert, my father cleared his throat in the particular way he always did before delivering news he considered generous. "Your mother and I have been thinking about your grandmother's house," he said, "and about Renee's living situation, now that her lease is up. And we think we've found a solution that works for everyone." I remember feeling, in that moment, a strange, cold clarity, the kind of feeling you get in the pit of your stomach half a second before you hear news that will change your life. As if some animal part of your brain already knows and is bracing your body before your conscious mind catches up. "We're going to give you the house on Maple Hollow, Claire," my father continued, smiling at me the way you'd smile at someone you were handing a modest but thoughtful gift. "It needs work, we know that. But it's got good bones, and it's paid off free and clear, so you and Daniel would have zero mortgage." That's huge, especially with, he gestured vaguely toward Daniel, toward the recent layoff, in a way that managed to be both dismissive and cruel in a single motion, with things being a little tight for you two lately. I opened my mouth. I don't know what I intended to say. I never got the chance. And for Renee, my mother said, practically glowing, since her lease is ending and she's had such a hard year with the divorce, your father, and I decided to help her get a fresh start. We found the most beautiful apartment downtown, the new building on Sycamore. You've probably seen it, with the rooftop pool, and we're covering the lease. Fully furnished. She can move in next week. There was a pause. I remember the pause more than almost anything else that happened that night. A pause in which I waited, genuinely, foolishly waited, for someone to acknowledge the size of the gap between what they had just described. Nobody did. Isn't that wonderful? My mother said, looking between us with the expression of a woman who believed, with total sincerity, that she had just distributed something fair. Renee, to her credit, looked briefly uncomfortable. She glanced at me, and for a half-second I thought she might say something, might push back, might ask why the math didn't add up. But then my mother reached over and squeezed her hand, and Renee's discomfort dissolved into something closer to relief, and she said, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. I don't know what I'd do without you," and the moment passed. I want to tell you I made some grand, dignified speech in that dining room. I want to tell you I stood up and calmly, articulately laid out 3 decades of documented favoritism and demanded they explain themselves. But that's not what happened. What happened is that I sat there, holding a dessert fork, feeling my face grow hot and my throat close, doing the math in my head the way I had done it my whole life, the trophy versus the finger painting, the bus versus the hatchback, the mailed card versus the live band, and I said, in a voice that came out smaller than I wanted it to, "The house needs a new roof. And there's water damage. I saw it when we cleaned it out after the funeral." "You've always been so capable, Claire," my mother said, patting my hand like this settled the matter. "You'll figure it out. You always do. You'll figure it out," for words that, if I am honest, functioned as the entire architecture of my childhood. Whatever I was denied, whatever I was shorted, whatever gap opened up between what I needed and what I received, the solution was always the same. I would figure it out. I always had. And, because I always had, nobody ever had to feel guilty about creating the gap in the first place. Daniel didn't say much at dinner. He's not a confrontational man, and I think he was as stunned as I was, turning the numbers over in his own head, the free-furnished luxury apartment against the free but literally rotting house, and trying to determine whether there was some angle he was missing that would make this make sense. There wasn't. We drove home in silence. About 10 minutes from our apartment, Daniel finally spoke. "Claire," he said quietly, "we don't have to take it." "We don't have anywhere else to go," I said. "Our lease is up in 2 months. You know that. We talked about this." "I know. He gripped the wheel a little tighter. "I just don't want you to feel like you have to be grateful for this." I looked out the window at the streetlights sliding past and didn't answer him, because the truth was more complicated than gratitude, and more complicated than anger, too. The truth was that some old, exhausted part of me had already started doing what it always did, calculating how to make the unfair thing survivable. Because that's what you learn to do. When you're the child who is handed less, you don't learn to demand more. You learn logistics. You learn to be resourceful with scraps because scraps are what you've always been given, and somewhere along the way, being good at surviving on scraps starts to feel like your one area of expertise, your one form of value in the family. I was good at making do. I had always been good at making do. It was, tragically, the only thing about me my parents had ever consistently praised. We got the keys the following Saturday. My father handed them to me in our driveway, almost casually, the way you'd hand someone a spare set of house keys before going on vacation, not the way you'd hand someone the deed to their entire future housing situation. "Roof's probably the biggest thing," he said. "But it's a solid house. Your grandmother loved it." "When was the last time you were actually inside it?" I asked. He paused, and something flickered across his face, not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. "It's been a while," he admitted. "Your grandmother didn't love visitors near the end." "You know how she was." I did know how she was. What he didn't know, what none of us really discussed, because my grandmother had been a private woman who kept her own counsel and didn't invite scrutiny into her affairs, was that in the last 2 years of her life, my grandmother had let almost no one into that house at all. Not even my father, her only child, more than a handful of times. She'd taken to meeting family at restaurants or on the porch, always with some excuse about the house being a mess or not fit for company. At the time, we'd all assumed it was pride, an elderly woman embarrassed that she could no longer keep up with the cleaning and repairs a big house demanded. Nobody thought to ask a harder question, which was, what, exactly, was she keeping people from seeing? I didn't think about that question yet, not that Saturday. That Saturday, I only thought about the smell. Daniel and I drove out to Maple Hollow that afternoon with cleaning supplies, work gloves, and a hopefulness I am almost embarrassed to admit I still had. Some small stubborn ember of belief that maybe it wouldn't be as bad as I remembered from the day we cleared out my grandmother's most personal belongings after the funeral. It was worse. The porch steps groaned under our weight in a way that made Daniel put a protective hand on my arm before we even reached the front door. Inside, the smell hit us immediately, a thick, wet, mineral smell of long-standing moisture, underlaid with something sourer that I would later learn was black mold, spreading in dark, spider-veined patches across the ceiling of the downstairs hallway. The living room curtains, once a deep forest green, had faded to a sickly gray-yellow and hung stiff with dust. A water stain the shape of a continent bloomed across the ceiling above the fireplace, and when I looked up, I could see, in one corner, a soft sag in the plaster that Daniel warned me not to stand under. "Claire," he said quietly, standing in the doorway to the kitchen, "you need to see this." The kitchen ceiling had a hole in it, not large, maybe 8 inches across, but a genuine hole, with a dark, wet ring spreading outward from it, evidence of a leak that had clearly been going on unaddressed for a very long time. Through the hole, if you tilted your head and looked up, you could see a sliver of the attic space above, and beyond that, impossibly, a thin seam of daylight, which meant the roof itself had a breach somewhere directly above. We spent that first day doing little more than surveying the damage and trying not to cry, in my case, or curse, in Daniel's. By the end of it, we had a list: roof replacement, mold remediation, kitchen ceiling repair, water-damaged flooring in at least 3 rooms, an ancient electrical panel that a cursory look told Daniel, who'd done some electrical work on the side in his early 20s, was almost certainly not up to code, a furnace that hadn't been serviced in what looked like a decade, and a basement that, when we finally worked up the nerve to go down there, had 2 inches of standing water pooled in the far corner. I sat down on the bottom porch step that evening, in the fading light, and did the math on my phone's calculator, plugging in rough estimates Daniel and I had scraped together from a quick search: roof, $15,000 to $20,000. Mold remediation, $5,000 to $10,000. Electrical, another $8,000 to $12,000. Basement waterproofing, $5,000 to $8,000. Kitchen ceiling and general repairs, several thousand more. By the time I finished adding it up, the number sitting on my screen was somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, just to make the house safe and livable. Before we even got to the cosmetic work of turning it into a home we could stand to look at every day. $40,000 to $60,000. Renee's apartment, the fully furnished, rooftop pool apartment my parents were paying for outright, cost roughly the same amount over the course of a 2-year lease, according to a listing I found later that made me feel sick to look at. My parents had spent, or were about to spend, roughly the same amount of money on my sister's comfort as it would take just to keep my house from actively falling down around me. I didn't cry on that porch step, though I want to be honest and tell you I came close. What I felt instead was something colder and more clarifying than grief, a kind of grim, quiet recalculation of everything I thought I understood about my place in this family, snapping into a sharper, uglier focus than it had ever had before. Daniel sat down next to me and put his arm around my shoulders. "We'll figure it out," he said gently. I laughed, a short, humorless sound that surprised us both. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. "It's just, that's exactly what my mother said. Word for word." He didn't say anything to that. He just held me a little tighter, and we sat there together on the crumbling porch of a house that smelled like rot and old water, watching the last of the daylight drain out of the sky, while 3 miles away, my sister was almost certainly unpacking boxes into a brand new closet in a brand new apartment with a view of the city, paid for in full by two parents who had told me, without a hint of self-awareness, that I would figure it out. We had 2 months until our old lease ended, which gave us a narrow window to make Maple Hollow, at minimum, livable. We didn't have the money for the full renovation, not even close, so we triaged. Daniel, using skills from his electrical side work years earlier, went through the panel and did what he legally could to make it safer, though we both knew a full rewiring job was inevitable eventually. We found a contractor willing to do the most urgent roof patch, not a full replacement, just enough to stop the active leak, for a price that still made me flinch when I transferred the deposit. We bought a dehumidifier for the basement and ran it around the clock. We scrubbed the mold from the hallway ceiling ourselves, wearing masks and gloves, breathing through our mouths, while I tried not to think about what it meant that we were doing manual labor in a house that had been given to us, unlike my sister, who had been given nothing to do but choose a paint color for an accent wall she didn't even have to paint herself. We moved in on a gray Tuesday morning at the end of that 2-month window, with a small U-Haul carrying the modest furniture we'd accumulated over 4 years of marriage. My mother texted that morning, *, good luck with the move. So excited for this new chapter for you too, *, no offer to help. No offer of even a token contribution toward the roof repair we'd had to pay for entirely out of our own savings, wiping out nearly all of it in one transaction. Just a cheerful text, sent, I imagined, from the comfort of whatever she was doing that day, blissfully unburdened by any awareness of what new chapter actually meant for us. Renee, for her part, posted photos of her own move that same week, a carousel on social media showing her new apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows, the rooftop pool glittering in golden hour light, a caption that read, *, sometimes life gives you exactly what you need right when you need it. So grateful. Clinking glasses sparkles * 247 likes. Comments from cousins and family friends gushing about how deserving she was, how happy they were for her, how beautiful the space looked. I didn't post anything about my move. There was nothing to post that wouldn't have required an explanation I wasn't ready to give the internet, or possibly myself. The first few weeks in the house were, if I'm honest, some of the hardest of my adult life. Every creak of the old floorboards at night made me tense, half convinced something structural was failing somewhere out of sight. Every time it rained, I found myself standing in the kitchen at odd hours, staring up at the patched ceiling, waiting to see if the patch would hold. Daniel took on a second part-time job on weekends, delivering groceries, to help rebuild the savings we'd drained on the roof, and I picked up extra shifts at the medical billing company where I worked, coming home most nights too exhausted to do anything but eat something quick and fall into bed in a room that still smelled, faintly, no matter how much we cleaned, of the water damage that had lived in these walls for years before we arrived. And through all of it, my mother called every so often, not often, but enough to ask, with what she seemed to genuinely believe was warm interest, "How's the house coming along? Getting settled in?" As though we were engaged in a charming home improvement project of our own choosing, a fun little fixer-upper adventure, rather than living in a structure that a home inspector, had we been able to afford one before moving in, would likely have flagged for multiple serious code violations. I want to pause here and tell you something important, which is that during those weeks, I genuinely believed this was simply the shape my life was going to take. I believed I was the daughter who got the hard version of everything, and that this was just one more entry in a long ledger I had stopped consciously counting a long time ago, because counting it never changed anything, and pretending not to count it was the only way I'd found to keep showing up at family dinners without falling apart. I had no idea that the house itself, the very thing my parents had offloaded onto me as an afterthought, a burden they assumed was worth so little that giving it to me barely registered as a decision at all, was about to become the center of a discovery that would upend everything I thought I understood about my family, my grandmother, and the actual, staggering value of what I had just spent 2 months scrubbing mold off of with my bare hands. It started with a knock on the door, 3 weeks after we moved in, on a rainy Thursday evening in early June. I was in the kitchen when the knock came, standing at the stove reheating leftovers, listening to rain hammer against the patched section of roof with the particular anxiety I'd developed over the past 3 weeks. The anxiety of someone waiting to find out if the thing holding their world together was actually going to hold. Daniel was working his second job that evening, so I was alone. I remember hesitating before I answered the door. It was almost 8 o'clock, and Maple Hollow Road wasn't the kind of street that got a lot of foot traffic after dark, especially not in the rain. I looked through the narrow window beside the door and saw a man standing on the porch, maybe in his early 60s, wearing a rain-spotted overcoat, holding a leather folder against his chest to keep it dry. He wasn't anyone I recognized, not a neighbor, not anyone from the funeral. He had the bearing of someone who'd spent a career in an office, though there was something slightly nervous in the way he shifted his weight, like a man rehearsing what he was about to say. I opened the door on the chain first, the way Daniel always told me to. "Can I help you? Mrs. Whitfield, or I'm sorry, I don't actually know your married name." "Claire, is it?" "Claire, Eleanor's granddaughter." His voice was careful, almost apologetic. Something about hearing my grandmother's first name from a stranger's mouth sent an odd chill through me. "Yes. Who are you?" "My name is Robert Holloway," he said. "I was your grandmother's attorney." Her personal attorney, not the one who handled the estate paperwork after she passed. That was a different firm, I believe, one your father selected. I handled some other matters for her. Private matters. "I'm sorry to come by so late and unannounced, but I only just found out 3 days ago that the estate had already been settled and the house transferred to you, and I felt this couldn't wait any longer than it already has." I stood there for a moment, rain blowing sideways into the porch light, trying to process what I was hearing. "I'm sorry, my grandmother's attorney?" "Nobody mentioned, my father handled everything after she passed. There wasn't any other attorney involved that I ever heard about." "That," Robert Holloway said, with a small, grim sort of smile, "is precisely the problem, Claire. May I come in? What I need to tell you shouldn't be said standing in the rain, and it shouldn't be said quickly. I want to be honest about my instincts in that moment, because I think they say something about the family I'd grown up in. My first thought was not this must be important, or even this could be dangerous. My first thought, reflexive, exhausted, 31 years in the making, was what has my family done now, some tired, cynical part of me was already bracing for one more disappointment, one more complication dressed up as a surprise. I unhooked the chain and let him in. We sat at my kitchen table, the same kitchen with the patched ceiling hole visible if you looked up, which he did, briefly, with an expression I couldn't quite read, and he set the leather folder down in front of him but didn't open it yet. "I've known your grandmother for almost 22 years, he began. "I want you to understand that before I say anything else, because I think it matters to how you hear the rest of this. Eleanor Whitfield was one of the sharpest, most deliberate people I've ever worked with in my career. Everything she did on purpose. I say that because I suspect, in the days ahead, certain people in your family are going to try to convince you that she wasn't in her right mind toward the end, or that her decisions don't reflect what she actually wanted. I was in regular contact with her until 6 weeks before she passed. She was entirely lucid. She knew exactly what she was doing, and exactly what she wanted to happen after she was gone." "Okay," I said slowly. "What did she want to happen?" Robert Holloway opened the folder. "Your grandmother came to me almost 11 years ago," he said, "shortly after your father. I want to be careful how I phrase this, because I wasn't present for the conversation and I only know her account of it. Shortly after your father asked her for what she described as a loan to help cover the cost of your sister Renee's private university tuition. Eleanor gave him the money. $80,000, if I recall the figure correctly. She told me she never expected to see it repaid, and she was right, she never was. But what troubled her wasn't the money itself. It was a conversation that happened around the same time, one she overheard at a family gathering in which your parents discussed openly, apparently, believing she was napping in another room, their plans for how they intended to handle their estate. And yours and your sister's inheritances, once Eleanor herself was gone and the family assets came fully into their control. I felt my stomach tighten. What did they say? According to Eleanor, your mother said, and I'm quoting from notes I took during our first meeting, that quote, Claire's never needed much to be happy. She'll make do with whatever's left over, but Renee needs to be set up properly. She's the one who's going to actually do something with her life. End quote. I sat very still. I had heard versions of this sentiment my entire life, implied, gestured at, embedded in 1,000 small decisions. I had never heard it stated so nakedly, so bluntly, as an actual plan, discussed at a family gathering as though it were a matter of practical logistics rather than a judgment about which of two children deserved love. Your grandmother was furious, Holloway continued. Not because your parents had made a mistake in her presence. She found that almost darkly funny, actually, she told me once, but because she realized, listening to that conversation, that this wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a philosophy, a settled belief, held by both your parents, about your worth relative to your sisters, and she understood, with real clarity, that if she left her estate to your father the way tradition and default assumption dictated, every asset she had spent her life building would eventually be filtered through that same philosophy, and you would end up with, in her words, nothing but the leftovers, same as always. So what did she do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She changed her estate plan, Holloway said. Completely. And she did it very quietly and very deliberately so that your father would never know until it was far too late to interfere. He slid a document across the table toward me. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at because the language was dense with legal terminology, but the core of it, once I parsed it, hit me like a physical blow. Your grandmother's will, Holloway said, the one your father's attorney handled, the one that transferred the house on Maple Hollow Road into your parents' names before they gifted it to you, that will only covered a small portion of Eleanor's actual estate. The house, some furniture, some personal effects. What it did not cover, because your grandmother structured it this way on purpose, was a trust she established privately, 11 years ago, funded initially with a portion of her late husband's life insurance payout that she never disclosed to your father, and grown substantially since then through investments she managed herself, with my assistance, in complete confidentiality. A trust, I repeated numbly. A trust, Holloway confirmed, with a single named beneficiary. You, Claire. Not your father. Not your sister. You. I remember the kitchen going very quiet around me, the sound of the rain against the roof suddenly distant, as though my hearing had narrowed to only Robert Holloway's voice. How much? I asked. He named a figure. I made him repeat it because I genuinely could not process it the first time. The trust, as of the most recent statement Holloway had received 2 months earlier, was valued at just over $1,400,000. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table long after Robert Holloway left, staring at the folder of documents he'd left with me, the trust paperwork, letters from my grandmother written in her own careful, slanted handwriting, and a separate document he'd saved for last, one he told me to read only after I'd had time to absorb the first shock. When Daniel got home from his second job a little after 11, he found me still sitting there, the folder open in front of me, tears finally coming, though not the tears I expected. I wasn't crying from joy, exactly, though there was some of that mixed in. I was crying the way you cry when something in you that has been braced and defended for 31 years is finally, suddenly, allowed to lower its guard, a strange, exhausted, disorienting kind of relief. I told him everything. He sat down across from me and listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "She saw you, Claire. This whole time, she saw you." That undid me more than the number had. Because that was the thing, underneath the money, underneath the shock of a hidden trust worth more than either of us had ever imagined possessing, the thing that actually broke something open in my chest was the realization that somewhere in this family, for over a decade, someone had been paying close, careful attention to what was happening to me, had understood the injustice of it in real time, and had quietly, patiently built a way to correct it, without ever once letting me know I was being watched over, because she hadn't wanted me to live my 20s and early 30s as someone waiting for a rescue. She had wanted me to build my own life on my own terms, and then, when the time came, she had wanted to make sure that life wasn't crushed under the weight of everything my parents had refused to give me. The letters in the folder made this even more explicit. In one, dated almost 9 years earlier, my grandmother had written, "Claire doesn't know I'm doing this, and I intend to keep it that way as long as I'm able. I don't want her growing up, though she's a grown woman already, I suppose, but you understand what I mean, waiting for a safety net instead of building her own strength. But I will not stand by and let this family's arithmetic decide, forever, that she is worth less than her sister. Someone has to balance the scale, and it seems it will have to be me, from beyond it, since I won't live to see whether her parents ever find the decency to do it themselves." I read that line perhaps a dozen times that night. But it was the second document Robert Holloway had left, the one he'd instructed me to save for last, that changed the entire shape of the story again, in a direction none of us, not even my grandmother, had fully anticipated. It was a property assessment, dated just 4 months before my grandmother's death, along with a letter from a historical preservation society and a separate letter from a development company. Attached to all of it was a note in my grandmother's handwriting. "Claire, if you're reading this, Robert has told you about the trust, and I imagine that news alone feels like more than enough for one evening. But there is one more thing you need to know, and it concerns the house itself, not just the money set aside beside it. Read the attached carefully. And forgive an old woman for keeping so many secrets. I promise you, every single one of them was in your favor." The historical preservation letter explained that the house on Maple Hollow Road, the same house my parents had dismissed as a burden, a decrepit fixer-upper not worth the paper of its own deed, had been formally identified. Through research the society had conducted 3 years earlier at my grandmother's own request, as one of the last surviving original structures from the town's founding-era timber boom. Built in 1897 by one of the region's most prominent architects of the period, a man whose other surviving works were now museums or protected landmarks. The house's distinctive wraparound porch, its stained glass transoms, its original hand-carved staircase, even the rotting wooden beams in certain sections, all of it, according to the assessment, represented a rare, largely intact example of a specific regional architectural style, of which fewer than a handful of examples remained standing anywhere in the state. The development letter was even more staggering. A regional development company, apparently unaware of the historical designation process quietly underway, had approached my grandmother 2 years before her death with an unsolicited offer to purchase the property, not for the house itself, but for the land, which sat on a larger parcel than any of us had ever really registered, backing onto a creek and a stretch of undeveloped acreage that the company intended to fold into a larger residential development project already underway less than half a mile down the road. Their offer, made in writing and never withdrawn, valued the property, land, and structure together at just under $900,000, contingent on the house's historical designation not being finalized, since a completed landmark designation would restrict what could be built there and reduce its value to a developer, even as it dramatically increased its value to a preservation-minded buyer, a museum trust, or a private owner who wanted to restore rather than demolish. My grandmother, it turned out, had spent the last 3 years of her life quietly, deliberately steering the house toward historical designation rather than accepting the developer's money. Not because she needed the money less than she needed to protect the house, but because, as one final letter in the folder explained, she wanted the house to go to me exactly as it was, undervalued in the eyes of anyone who only looked at its surface, and worth almost unimaginably more to anyone who took the time to actually look closely at what it really was. "Your parents saw a burden," she'd written, in what I now understood to be one of the last letters she ever composed, dated less than 2 months before she died. "They saw peeling paint and a leaking roof and decided it was the lesser gift, the consolation prize, the thing you get when you're the daughter nobody thinks is worth investing in. They were not wrong that it needs work, Claire. but they were catastrophically wrong about everything else. This house is one of the last of its kind left standing in this entire region. It is protected, or will be, by the time you read this, since the designation process should complete within the year, which means it cannot be torn down, cannot be substantially altered without oversight, and is eligible for state and federal historical restoration grants that will cover a significant portion of any repair costs, provided the work is done to preservation standards. I have already spoken to a preservation-focused contractor, a wonderful woman named Priya Desai, who has agreed to walk you through the process when you're ready. Her number is attached. Beyond even that, homes with this designation, once restored, routinely sell, if their owners ever choose to sell, which I very much hope you won't, because I always loved this house and hoped it would stay in the family, for 2 to 3 times the value of comparable homes in the area, precisely because there are so few of them left, and buyers who love architecture and history will pay extraordinary sums for something authentic and rare. They gave you what they thought was nothing, Claire. They had no idea they were giving you something that cannot be replicated, cannot be built new no matter how much money someone throws at it, and cannot be taken away from you by anyone, now that the designation is nearly complete. I wanted you to have not just the money in the trust, though heaven knows you've earned every penny of it and more, for everything this family put you through. I wanted you to have the thing they threw away without looking at it twice, and I wanted you to be the one who discovered, in your own time, exactly what it was actually worth. I set the letter down on the kitchen table, in the house that 30 seconds earlier I had believed to be a burden I would spend the next decade of my life slowly paying off, and I laughed, a real laugh, surprised and disbelieving and a little hysterical. The kind of laugh that comes right before you start crying again, which I also did, for the second time that night, though this time Daniel was there to hold me while I did it. I didn't tell my parents right away. I want to be honest about why, because I've thought about it a lot since then, turned it over in my mind trying to understand my own motives, and I think the truth is layered. Part of it was practical. Robert Holloway advised me to let the historical designation finish processing. It was expected to be finalized within about 6 weeks, before making any public announcements about the property, since a premature announcement could, in theory, invite complications from the development company that had once tried to buy the land, or create pressure from other interested parties before I'd had a chance to fully understand my own options. But part of it, if I'm honest, was something less practical and more human. For the first time in my life, I had something that was entirely mine, knowledge, resources, a future that my parents had no hand in creating and no claim over shaping, and some quiet, long-starved part of me wanted to sit with that feeling for a while before I let anyone else touch it. I wanted a few weeks where I wasn't Claire who figures it out, or Claire who makes do, or Claire whose worth was measured against Renee's in some invisible ledger my parents kept without ever showing either of us the math. I just wanted to be Claire, sitting in her grandmother's house, understanding for the first time in her adult life what it actually felt like to be chosen, deliberately and completely, by someone who loved her. During those 6 weeks, Daniel and I met several times with Priya Desai, the preservation contractor my grandmother had already vetted and lined up for us. Priya walked the entire house with us, room by room, and it was during that walkthrough that I began to understand the house not as a burden, but as something closer to a wound that had simply never been properly tended. Every flaw she pointed out, she paired with an explanation of what lay beneath it that was worth saving. The water-stained ceiling in the living room, once repaired, would reveal original hand-applied plaster medallions around the light fixture, a decorative technique almost nobody still practiced. The ancient, electrical panel Daniel had flagged as unsafe sat inside a utility closet with original built-in shelving crafted from old-growth chestnut wood, a material virtually extinct in modern construction since a blight wiped out most American chestnut trees a century ago. Even the smell that had haunted me during our first walk-through, the wet, mineral rot smell I'd associated with decay and punishment, turned out to be concentrated almost entirely in one section of flooring near a single failed gutter. A contained and fixable problem rather than the pervasive structural catastrophe I had assumed it represented. Your grandmother used to tell me this house just needed someone to actually look at it, Priya said, during our second visit, running her hand along a section of the original staircase banister, worn smooth by more than a century of hands. She said most people only see what a house costs to fix. She said the trick is learning to see what it costs to lose. We also met with a historical restoration grant coordinator through the State Preservation Office, who walked us through a program that would, once the designation was finalized, cover up to 60% of qualified restoration costs, meaning the $40,000 to $60,000 in repairs I had once calculated on that porch step, sick with dread, would likely end up costing us closer to $15,000 or $20,000 out of pocket, a number that, combined with the trust my grandmother had left me, I could now cover without hardship, without debt, without a single sleepless night spent wondering how we'd manage it. I want to pause here and tell you something about how strange those 6 weeks felt, living a kind of double life. At work, at family gatherings, because yes, there were a couple of family gatherings during that window, birthday dinners, and one Sunday lunch I forced myself to attend, I was still, outwardly, the same Claire everyone expected, quiet, capable, unassuming. The daughter who'd been handed the rotting house and hadn't complained about it. My mother asked, at one of those dinners, how the little fixer-upper was coming along, and I said, evenly, it's coming along, and let her assume whatever she wanted to assume, while inside me a whole new architecture of self-understanding was quietly, steadily being built. Renee, during this period, seemed happy, genuinely happy, in the uncomplicated way she'd always been able to access more easily than I had, cushioned as she'd always been from the kind of scarcity that makes happiness complicated. She invited me to see the new apartment once, during those 6 weeks, and I went, and I want to be truthful, it was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a kitchen island with waterfall quartz countertops, a walk-in closet bigger than the bedroom I'd shared with Daniel in our old rental. She gave me the full tour with unself-conscious pride, and at the end of it she hugged me and said, "I'm so glad you and Daniel got the house, though. I always loved Grandma's place. I'm glad it's staying in the family, you know? I hope you guys are able to fix it up eventually." I remember standing in her gleaming kitchen, holding a glass of wine, absorbing that sentence, "I'm glad it's staying in the family. I hope you guys are able to fix it up eventually," spoken with total, unthinking ease by someone who had never once had to wonder whether eventually was a timeline she could actually afford. I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her about the trust, or the historical designation, or the number Robert Holloway had said with a straight face at my kitchen table. I just smiled and said, "We're working on it," and let the moment pass, filing it away with a strange mixture of tenderness and grief. Tenderness, because I still loved my sister, even now, even knowing everything I knew. Grief, because I understood, with total clarity for the first time, that her comfort had never once been weighed against my absence of it, in either of our parents' minds, and that she had lived her whole life without ever having to notice that fact, which was its own kind of privilege, invisible and total. The historical designation for the house on Maple Hollow Road was finalized on a Tuesday in late July, a little over 6 weeks after Robert Holloway first knocked on my door. He called to tell me himself, and I remember sitting down hard on the porch steps, the same steps where I'd once done grim arithmetic about foundation repairs and mold remediation, feeling something settle in my chest that I can only describe as a kind of homecoming, though I hadn't fully realized, until that moment, how much of my identity had still been quietly braced for someone to take this away from me. "There's something else," Holloway said, his voice carrying a note of barely contained amusement. "The regional development company that made that offer on the land a couple years back, the one your grandmother turned down, they got wind of the designation finalizing. They called my office yesterday. They wanted to know if the new owner, that's you, might be interested in reopening a conversation about selling, historical designation notwithstanding. They mentioned a number." "What number?" "1.1 million, he said. For the land and structure, designation and all, on the theory that a restored historical property would be worth a great deal to them as a centerpiece for the residential development they're already building around it. A marketing feature, essentially. Come live near this beautifully restored 1897 landmark." I told them I'd pass the message along, but I also told them, quite honestly, that I doubted you'd be interested in selling. I sat with that number for a long moment. $1.1 million for a house my parents had considered such an insignificant, undesirable burden that handing it to me had barely registered to them as a decision worth deliberating over. And I felt something crystallize in me that had been forming, slowly, over the previous 6 weeks. Not just relief. Not just financial security, though God knows that mattered more than I could easily put into words after years of watching Daniel, and I stretch every dollar as far as it would go. What crystallized, sitting on that porch, phone still warm against my ear, was resolve. A clear, calm, entirely unfamiliar sense that I was finally ready to say something to my parents that I had swallowed for 31 years. "Thank you, Robert," I said. "Tell them no. We're not selling. But I think it's time I told my family what's actually been happening here." "I thought you might say that," he said, and I could hear something like pride in his voice, the particular pride of a man who had spent over 2 decades quietly honoring the wishes of a woman he had clearly respected a great deal, and who was glad, at last, to see her plan reach the daughter it had always been meant for. "For what it's worth, Claire, Eleanor would be very proud of how you've handled all of this. She always said you had more steel in you than anyone in this family ever gave you credit for." I think she was right. I chose to tell my parents the same way they'd once told me about the houses, at a family dinner, at their table, with Renee present, because I wanted the reveal to land in the same room, on the same kind of evening, as the moment that had once made me feel so small. I'm not proud of the theatricality of that choice, exactly, but I also don't apologize for it. Some corrections need to happen in the same room where the original injury occurred. I invited myself over on a Sunday in early August, telling my mother only that Daniel and I had some news to share, vague enough that she assumed, I found out later, that I was pregnant. And she'd apparently spent the intervening days quietly buying baby items in preparation for an announcement that was, to put it mildly, not the one she got. We sat at the same dining table. My mother had made a roast, the same instinctive performance cooking she always reached for when she anticipated a moment worth marking. Renee arrived a few minutes after us, cheerful, unsuspecting, asking almost immediately, with real warmth, "So? What's the big news?" I looked at Daniel. He nodded, once, a small gesture of support that steadied me more than he probably realized. "About 3 months ago," I began, "a man named Robert Holloway knocked on my front door. He was Grandma Eleanor's personal attorney, not the one who handled her estate paperwork after she passed, a different one none of you ever knew existed, because Grandma never told any of you about him." I watched my father's face change first, a small, wary tightening around his eyes, the look of a man sensing, before he understood why, that the ground beneath him was not as solid as he'd believed. "What are you talking about?" my mother asked. "Eleanor's affairs were all handled through Whitcomb and Reyes. We went through everything with them after the funeral." "You went through everything you were told about," I said, keeping my voice level, though my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. "Grandma set up a private trust 11 years ago. A trust none of your attorneys knew about, because she structured it that way on purpose, with a different attorney entirely, so that it would never show up in the estate paperwork you all reviewed." "A trust," my father repeated slowly. "For what?" "For me," I said. "Just me. Currently valued at just over $1.4 million. The silence that followed was, I think, the loudest silence I have ever sat inside. Renee's mouth actually fell open slightly. My mother set down her fork with a small, precise click against the china, and I watched her face perform a rapid sequence of expressions: confusion, disbelief, something that might have been the very beginning of calculation, before settling into a kind of frozen, polite blankness that I recognized, uncomfortably, as the exact expression she used to wear whenever I'd brought home a good grade she didn't quite know how to praise without also praising Renee. "That's Claire. That can't be right," my mother said. "Eleanor didn't have that kind of money. She clipped coupons. She wore the same 3 cardigans for 20 years. She wore the same 3 cardigans, I agreed, and quietly built a 7-figure trust for the granddaughter she watched this family treat like an afterthought for 3 decades. Both things are true. I have the documentation if you'd like to see it. Robert has copies of everything, the trust paperwork, her investment statements, and letters. She wrote me a lot of letters, actually, explaining why. Why, my father said, his voice tight now, would she do that? Why wouldn't she just leave things to be split evenly, the way it should have been? I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, because I wanted him to sit inside the question a little longer than he was comfortable with. Because 11 years ago, I said, at a family gathering, she overheard you and Mom talking about how you plan to handle the estate. She heard Mom say, and I'm quoting from Robert's notes, taken directly from a conversation with Grandma about this, that Claire's never needed much to be happy. She'll make do with whatever's left over, but Renee needs to be set up properly. Because she's the one who's going to actually do something with her life. I watched the color drain out of my mother's face. I never said that, she said, but her voice had lost its certainty, and something in her eyes told me she remembered saying exactly that, or something close enough to it that the denial felt hollow even as she made it. Grandma heard it, I said. And it broke something for her, I think, hearing that stated so plainly, not as an accident, not as a slip, but as an actual philosophy you both held about which of your daughters deserved investment. So she spent the next decade quietly building a way to make sure that philosophy didn't get to decide my entire future. And it wasn't just the trust. I took a slow breath. The house is a historically designated landmark now, Mom. Built in 1897 by a well-known regional architect. One of the last of its kind still standing. A development company has offered me $1.1 million for the land and structure. I turned it down. We're not selling. We're restoring it, with state and federal preservation grants covering most of the cost, exactly the way Grandma planned before she died. Renee, who had been silent this entire time, finally spoke, her voice small. The house is worth over $1 million? The house alone, yes, I said, and then, because I didn't want this to become a moment about property values instead of about what it actually meant, I added, more quietly, but that's not really the point, Renee. The point is that Grandma looked at how this family treated me for 31 years, and she decided, on her own, without telling anyone, that someone needed to correct it. She didn't do that because I asked her to. I never even knew she'd noticed. She did it because she was paying attention this whole time, in a way neither of you ever did. I wish I could tell you that my parents responded to that dinner with immediate, graceful accountability, that my mother wept and apologized for 31 years of favoritism, that my father admitted, without defensiveness, that he had failed me as a parent. That is not what happened, and I think it's important I tell you the truth of it, because I suspect many of you listening have lived some version of this same disappointment, the disappointment of confronting a parent with clear, undeniable evidence of harm and watching them reach, instead, for justification. My mother's first instinct was not guilt. It was indignation. So this whole time, she said, her voice rising, Eleanor was keeping secrets from this family? Setting up some shadow inheritance behind our backs? Don't you think that's a little manipulative, Claire? Don't you think it's a little strange that she'd do something so deceptive? I remember staring at her, genuinely stunned, that even now, confronted with the exact quote that had prompted my grandmother's decision, my mother's first reaction was to reframe herself as the wronged party. She wasn't being deceptive toward you, I said, as evenly as I could manage. She was protecting me from you. There's a difference. That's not fair, my mother snapped. We gave you a house. A house that turns out to be worth over $1 million, according to you. How is that a shortchanging you? You gave me a house you believed was worthless, I said. You told me, at this exact table, that I would figure it out, about a structure with black mold and a caving roof, while you paid for Renee's entire apartment because you assumed correctly, based on everything you'd shown me my whole life, that I wouldn't push back, because I never had before. You didn't know it was valuable. Neither of you had set foot in that house in years. You handed it to me the same way you've handed me everything else in this family, as an afterthought, dressed up as generosity. My father, who had been quiet through most of this exchange, finally spoke, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected, almost hollow. Is that really how you felt this whole time? Like an afterthought. Yes, I said, and something in my own voice cracked slightly, because for all my careful preparation, all the calm I'd rehearsed on the drive over, that question still found the rawest part of me. Every single time, Dad. The spelling trophy you didn't look at. The bus while Renee got a car. The mailed card with $40 in it for my college graduation while Renee got a live band. I've been counting my whole life, even when I told myself I'd stopped. And I never said anything, because I didn't think it would change anything, and because some part of me was always afraid that if I said it out loud, you'd just confirm what I already suspected, that you'd decided, a long time ago, that I mattered less. The table was silent. Renee, I noticed, had tears running freely down her face, though she hadn't spoken. I need you to understand something, my mother said, after a long pause, her voice quieter now, though still tight with something defensive. We love you exactly as much as we love your sister. If we ever gave you a different impression, that was never our intention. Intentions don't undo 31 years of evidence, Mom, I said. I'm not trying to punish you. I didn't come here tonight to gloat about money, even though I understand how it might look that way. I came here because I needed you to know the truth, and because I needed to finally say, out loud, in this house, at this table, the same table where you told me I'd figure it out, that I saw it. I saw all of it, every single time, and I'm done pretending I didn't. I stood up. Daniel stood with me, his hand finding mine. We're not selling the house, I said, and I'm not interested in fighting over Grandma's trust, because it isn't a family asset to fight over, it was hers, and she gave it to exactly who she intended to give it to. For exactly the reasons she explained in her letters, which I'm happy to show either of you, if you actually want to understand rather than just defend yourselves. I'm going home now. I hope, eventually, we can find our way to something healthier than this. But I'm not going to keep making myself smaller so this family's math keeps working out the way it always has. We left. Renee followed us out to the driveway, still crying, and caught my arm before I could get into the car. Claire, she said, I didn't know. I swear to you, I never knew it was like this for you. I don't know what I thought. I thought things were just easier for me because I was younger, because I was the baby. I never once thought it was because they thought I was worth more than you. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years, because it had always been easier to let a low, simmering resentment exist between us at a safe emotional distance than to actually examine what she had and hadn't known, and I saw, for the first time, that she was telling the truth. She hadn't known, because she had never had to know. That was the whole architecture of the unfairness. It had been invisible to her precisely because it had always worked in her favor. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. I'm not angry at you, Renee. I need you to know that. I'm not going to pretend the last 3 decades didn't happen, and I think we both have some things to work through, honestly, about how we relate to each other after growing up on such different sides of the same house. But none of what happened tonight is about punishing you. It never was. She hugged me, tightly, in that driveway, and I let her, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the hug didn't feel like something performed for our parents' benefit. It felt real. News like this doesn't stay contained to a single dinner table, and I hadn't expected it to. Within a week, my mother had called my aunt, my father's sister, presumably looking for some kind of validation, and instead received, as I learned secondhand, a fairly blunt reminder that Eleanor had always been sharper than any of you gave her credit for, and that maybe it's worth asking yourself why she felt she had to do this instead of trusting you to do right by Claire on your own. My mother did not take that well. She called me 3 days after the dinner, her voice tight with an emotion I initially mistook for continued anger, but which I slowly realized, as the call went on, was something closer to panic. People are going to think we're terrible parents, she said. Do you understand what this looks like, Claire? Your grandmother's secretly cutting us out, secretly favoring you, and now everyone in the family is going to hear about it and think we did something to deserve that. I remember feeling a strange, exhausted clarity in that moment, the recognition that even now, confronted with the actual content of what had happened, my mother's primary concern was not the 31 years of documented favoritism, not the pain she caused, but the social optics of being perceived as the kind of parents who might cause that pain. "Mom," I said, as gently as I could manage, "I think the thing to focus on right now isn't what people think. It's whether what Grandma believed about you and Dad was true. Because if it wasn't true, this is a terrible misunderstanding, and I genuinely want to help repair that. But if it was true, if you really did believe, all these years, that I'd be fine with less because I didn't need as much as Renee, then the problem isn't what people think. The problem is what actually happened." She didn't have an answer for that. The call ended shortly after, without resolution, in the particular unsatisfying way so many of our conversations had ended over the years, not with reconciliation, but with a kind of exhausted stalemate, both of us retreating to our respective corners to process the exchange alone. My father reached out differently. About 2 weeks after the dinner, he asked if he could come by the house alone, without my mother, to see, he said, the work you and Daniel are doing on the place. I agreed, cautiously, and he arrived on a Saturday morning looking older than I remembered, or maybe just more tired, and he walked through the house slowly, quietly, running his hand along the same chestnut-wood shelving Priya had shown us, standing for a long moment in front of the ceiling medallion now visible after the plaster repair, studying it the way you might study an old photograph of someone you'd forgotten you used to know. "Your grandmother loved this house," he said finally. "I used to visit here as a kid. I'd forgotten how beautiful some of it was, underneath everything that had gone wrong with it." "That's sort of the whole point, Dad," I said quietly. "You have to actually look at something to know what it's worth. You can't just glance at the surface and decide." He nodded slowly, and for a moment I thought he understood, really understood, not just the metaphor, but what it meant about me, about the 3 decades of surface-level glancing that had led him to conclude, without ever really examining the evidence, that I was the daughter who needed less. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said, and his voice, when it came, sounded genuinely different than it had at that dinner table, less defensive, more raw. "I don't have a good excuse for it. I think it's easier to love a child who doesn't ask you for anything. Renee always needed things, wanted things, made her needs known. You never did. And I think somewhere along the way, your mother and I mistook your not asking for not needing, and it was easier, honestly, to let that mistake stand, because correcting it would have meant admitting we'd been getting it wrong for years. I'm not proud of that. I don't know how to fix 31 years of it. But I am sorry, and I mean that, even if it comes a lot later than it should have. It wasn't everything. It didn't erase the trophy, or the bus, or the mailed card, or the roast dinner where he'd handed me a rotting house without a second thought and moved on to the next topic before I'd even processed what had happened. But it was more honesty than I had received from either of my parents in 3 decades combined, and I found that I was able to accept it, not as full repair, but as a genuine, if belated, beginning. "Thank you for saying that," I told him. "I don't know exactly what happens next between us. But I'm glad you said it." Over the following year, Daniel and I worked with Priya Desai and her small restoration crew to bring the house on Maple Hollow Road back to something close to its original glory. It was slow work, careful work, done to preservation standards that meant every repair had to honor the building's original character rather than simply patching over its problems. The roof restored with historically accurate materials rather than modern shortcuts, the original staircase banister carefully stripped and refinished rather than replaced. The stained glass transoms above the doors professionally restored by a craftsman who specialized in exactly this kind of century-old glasswork. The state and federal preservation grants covered nearly 60% of the total cost, exactly as my grandmother had promised in her letter, and the remainder came comfortably out of the trust she'd left me, a trust one found myself, more than once, sitting within quiet gratitude, thinking about a woman who had spent the last decade of her life quietly, patiently building a bridge to a future she would never get to see me cross. By the following spring, the house was transformed. Not unrecognizable, Priya had been careful, throughout the process, to preserve its essential character, the wraparound porch, the original windows, the particular slant of afternoon light through the restored, stained glass in the front hall. But transformed nonetheless, from a structure that had once made me sit in my car for 45 minutes, too afraid to go inside, into a home that made visitors stop on the porch steps and simply look, for a moment, before they could bring themselves to knock. We held a small gathering when the restoration was finally complete, not a big party, just close friends and, after some hesitation on my part, my parents and Renee. It felt important, somehow, to let them see the finished house, not as a gesture of reconciliation exactly, but as a kind of quiet, undeniable testimony. This is what was here the whole time. This is what you almost let a developer tear down because you never once thought to look closely. My mother walked through the finished rooms mostly in silence, and I watched her, at one point, standing in front of the restored ceiling medallion in the living room, her expression difficult to read. She didn't say much that day about what she was feeling, and I didn't push her to. Some repairs happen slowly, quietly, in private, the same way the damage did. It's been 2 years now since Robert Holloway first knocked on my door in the rain. Daniel and I still live in the house on Maple Hollow Road, and I can tell you, without exaggeration, that it is the first home in my entire adult life that has ever felt like it was actually, unambiguously mine, not a compromise, not a consolation prize, not the lesser half of an unequal inheritance, but a place my grandmother chose for me, specifically, deliberately, because she believed I deserved something rare and lasting, even when the rest of my family couldn't see it. My relationship with my parents remains, honestly, a work in progress. We speak more than we used to, and less defensively than we used to, and my father, in particular, has made a genuine, sustained effort over these 2 years to show up differently, remembering our anniversary now, asking real questions about my work, showing up when Daniel had a minor surgery last year in a way that surprised both of us with its consistency. My mother's growth has been slower, more halting, marked by occasional relapses into the old defensiveness, but even she, I think, has started to understand, in her own way, that the family's old arithmetic, the quiet, unspoken calculation that decided, year after year, which daughter deserved investment and which daughter would simply figure it out, cost her something too. It cost her 31 years of a relationship with me that could have been so much easier, so much warmer, if she'd simply paid attention the way my grandmother did. Renee and I are closer now than we've ever been, which is perhaps the outcome I'm most grateful for, out of everything that happened. We talk regularly. She's asked me more than once hard questions about our childhood that she'd never previously had reason to ask. Questions like, did I really get everything and you got nothing, or am I misremembering? Questions that require me to be honest in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable for both of us, but that have, slowly, built something between us that feels more like an actual friendship than the strained, distant sisterhood we grew up with. As for the trust and the house's value and the extraordinary financial security my grandmother's decade of quiet planning provided, I think about it less than you might expect, honestly. Not because it doesn't matter, it matters enormously, and I would be lying if I told you it hasn't changed my life in very concrete ways, from the ease with which Daniel and I now plan for our future, to the peace of mind that comes from knowing we'll never again have to choose between fixing a roof and paying rent. But the thing I actually think about most days, standing in the restored kitchen of a house that was once dismissed as worthless by the 2 people who were supposed to know my worth better than anyone else on earth, is something simpler than money. I think about my grandmother, sitting alone in this house in her final years, quietly refusing to let anyone inside, not out of embarrassment about the mess, as we'd all assumed, but because she was protecting a secret she'd built entirely for me. A decade-long act of devotion so patient, so deliberate, so completely unlike anything else I'd ever received from this family, that it rearranged, permanently, my understanding of what it means to actually be seen by someone who loves you. My parents looked at that house and saw a burden not worth investing in, the same way, for 31 years, they looked at me and reached the same conclusion. They were wrong about the house. They were wrong about me too. It just took a stranger's knock on a rainy Thursday evening and the quiet, unshakable devotion of a woman who refused to let her family's failures become my inheritance, for the truth of that to finally come to light. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sit on the wraparound porch of the house on Maple Hollow Road, in a chair positioned exactly where my grandmother's used to sit, and I watch the light change over the restored gardens Daniel and I planted last spring. And I think about how close I came to never knowing any of this, how easily an entire decade of my grandmother's careful, loving planning could have unraveled if Robert Holloway had waited even a few more weeks to find out the estate had already been settled, if the historical designation had fallen through, if I had, in a moment of despair during those first exhausting weeks of mold and water damage, simply given up and sold the house before anyone ever discovered what it truly was. I didn't give up. I scrubbed the mold myself on my knees in a house I believed was worthless, because giving up had simply never been an option I'd been taught to consider. And in the end, that quiet, stubborn refusal to abandon something just because it looked broken turned out to be the exact quality my grandmother had been counting on all along, not because she wanted to test me, but because she knew, better than anyone else in my family ever had, exactly who I was and exactly what I was capable of building if someone finally gave me the chance. They gave me a rotting house, thinking it was nothing. It turned out to be everything.